again, but don't shut the program off until I tell you to shut it off. And I had bought a camera with me, what do they call these cameras here? The ones that play these things here. Anyway, I took a video of it the second time they played it. And it was the first time I really used the camera, and it was a little shaky if you ever get to look at it. But it shows you everything that was on the screen. And as they're playing the second one, they shut it off again toward the end. And I finally said, there must be something wrong with our communications, because I didn't come from the South. I said, I want you to leave it on until I say, shut it off. And they were a little hesitant. They didn't want to do that. And I finally told the engineer there, I said, you either do it, I tell you, or tomorrow you're going to have to find another job. So they let it play. Well, toward the end, the controllers had taken a United, and they asked him if they could delay his arrival time and have him check this 747 that was coming southbound. So they vectored him over to the 747. He's about 2,000 feet beneath them. And the United says, it's a beautiful airplane, the moon behind him, it looks good. He says, it's so clear up here, you can see into next Tuesday. And then he passed by. Well, after he passed by, that target that had been chasing the 747 turned around and started following the United as he went down into Alaska. Now, when the Japanese pilot first commanded the frequency, for you guys that are familiar with radar or how the military or the controllers work, when he first commanded the frequency for the controller, the first words out of his mouth was, do you have traffic for me? And when the controller hears these words, it means doom, because right away he forgot something. He's got somebody else up there that shouldn't, and why would a pilot ask if we had traffic? And he looked at his scope and he says, negative, there's no traffic in your area. And the Japanese pilot says, oh yeah, there's traffic out here. And it's at 12 o'clock and about 8 miles, he's telling them. Well, the next thing the controller says is, can you tell me what type is? Can you make out the type of aircraft? Any markings on the plane that we can find out who it is? He's thinking it's a military aircraft. And the Japanese pilot says, there's no markings. It's as big as 4 aircraft carriers. It has yellow and white lights around the center. And it's big, and he was a little bit worried. Well, this machine followed him down for 31 minutes. Halfway through his flight, he makes a 360-degree turn. Now, when I say he makes it, he doesn't do anything unless the FAA says you can do this. So they told him, if you want to deviate, you want to change your altitude, let us know. And he changed his altitude a couple times, makes a 360, and this UFO stayed with him all the way. Scared the pants off him. I don't know how much more time I got. Anyway, when I got done with
about a minute and a half to 2 minutes.
Okay, so I shoot back to the FAA Center, and the administrator at the time was Admiral Ingen. I don't know if you guys knew Admiral Ingen. I got there about 4:45 because I wanted to go home with my wife. And he heard I was in the building, so he calls me up and he says, give me a 5-minute briefing on what you're seeing. So I gave him what I'm telling you guys here. And he wanted to know if that video I took would play on his TV, and I said, I guess so. The book says it can. So I plugged it in there, and after a few minutes of watching the video, he calls the aide over and he says, go tell Kennedy I'm going to be a few minutes late. So he's watching it a little bit more, and then he finally calls the aide over and says, go cancel the rest of my appointments tonight. We'll reschedule for sometime next week. He says, I have to go see the president, and we're talking about Reagan. So when he got all done, he says, don't talk to anybody. I'll get back with you, and I'll tell you what to do. I'm on my way to see Reagan. Next morning, I came to work, and I got a call from some guy who said he was at the CIA. He wanted to talk about a UFO. I said, well, you're talking to the wrong guy. I don't know anything about UFOs. He says, well, the one that happened over Alaska, I said, you probably want to talk to the Admiral. I don't know what you're talking about. A few minutes later, the Admiral calls down and says, I've set up a briefing for you tomorrow at 10 o'clock or 9 o'clock, whatever it was, in the round room. He says, the president's scientific staff is coming over. Some CIA guys will be there. I think he said 3, matter of fact, and some grunts will be coming along with them. He says, your task is to hand this stuff off to them. When they leave here, they have to take this with them because the FAA does not control UFOs. Now, I showed them all this stuff, and when they
You
got
have
all...
about 45 seconds. So.
Okay. When they got all done, one of the scientists come out and said they had 3 or 4 questions. They wanted to know the speed of the antenna, the frequency of the antenna, the logarithm for the height-finding equipment, and the people I brought with me just happened to be experts, and they answered all the questions. When they get done, the CIA guy standing next to me says to the people, this event, pointing to the big screen they have in the room, this event never happened. We were never here. We're confiscating all this data, and you're all sworn to secrecy. Scared the pants off them. I had 22 people in there, and they were leaving the room right away, not know what's going to happen. So I said to this guy, well, what do you think it was? I'm thinking at the time it's a stealth bomber. He says, oh, he says, it's a UFO. Look at these guys. They're drooling. They can't wait to get their hands on all this data. We had boxes and boxes in those days of printouts. Can't wait to get their hands on that stuff. I says, is that right? He says, yeah, this is the first time they ever had more than a moment of radar data to look at. Now, the big key was the word he had said, this is the first time they ever had more than a minute or so of radar data, okay. And now we've got 31 minutes.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, Major Filer, if you could.
Yes.
Go ahead.
I'm a retired Air Force major with 5,000 flying hours, and I'm currently the Eastern Regional Director of the Mutual UFO Network, which is studying this phenomenon, and editor of the Filer's Files. When I was flying for the Air Force 420th Air Refueling Squadron stationed at RAF Sculthorpe in England in January of '62, we were in orbit for refueling fighter aircraft over the North Sea at about 30,000 feet in our KB-50J tanker just after sunset on a clear night. London Control excitedly called us and notified us that they had an unidentified object hovering on their radar near Stonehenge. We were asked if we were willing to intercept the unidentified craft, and our refueling mission had just finished, so we quickly agreed to chase their UFO. We were given an intercept heading and started to dive toward the UFO. It was really an exciting situation. Next, and we were to go towards Stonehenge, which is over the center of England. Next. London Control was diverting all aircraft out of our way so that we could have a clear path for the intercept. Then we realized we were above our red line speed on the aircraft and had to pull back on the power. And London Control started giving us distances to the hovering UFO. Next. It was some 60 miles ahead and then 40 and so on. And as we got closer, we got the radar going on our aircraft and picked up the hovering UFO in the distance, about 30 miles. It was an exceptionally large radar return. Next. And just judging on the size of the radar return, it was about equal to the Brooklyn Bridge or the Firth of Forth Bridge in Scotland, which is a huge bridge about a mile long. It was the biggest radar return that I'd ever seen on the aircraft radar. And it was sharp and solid as compared to the fuzziness of a rain cloud. I felt the craft must be made of steel or some kind of strong metal. Next. We were doing about 425 miles per hour as we approached to about 10 miles. This gives you an example of how large a radar return it was. It was a dark night, and we could only see a series of dim lights directly ahead. Next. This is something what it looked like in the distance. Suddenly the UFO seemed to come alive, and the lights brightened immensely, and the UFO accelerated in a launch similar to a space shuttle taking off. Next. Lit up the sky and disappeared, frankly. We saw much brighter lights and a fantastic acceleration. it seemed to go straight up, just estimating speed like 50,000 miles an hour, 100 times faster than we were moving. We asked London Control if they had any rocket launches in the area. London Control seemed as disappointed as we were, and the controller said, "There are no rocket launches in the area. Thank you for your intercept. You are now cleared to return to your mission." The incident was recorded in my navigator's log and was mentioned the next day in operations. Interestingly, the Air Force did not seem particularly interested. A few weeks later, we were invited to a dining in with Prince Philip as a speaker, and he asked to speak with the air crews that had chased UFOs. So apparently London Control had told him that we had chased this UFO, and we sat down at the table with him, and he was very friendly, and I essentially told him what I just told you, and he indicated that he regularly interviewed the air crews that were chasing UFOs. Either he or his aide would interview them. And I asked why Prince Philip was personally interested in UFOs, and he said that his uncle, the Earl Mountbatten, had seen the UFOs close up in the Navy, and that obviously he believed his uncle. Next. Prince Philip. Next. This gives you some indications of the ships that this one was taken over Japan. And if you notice, there's a large cylinder, but outside the cylinder, there's 12 disc craft. And this is typically what they do. They're often called motherships because they launch these smaller disc-shaped craft from them. Next. This picture was taken by NASA over the Atlantic Ocean and near Iceland. Next. And this one was actually a video. This is one shot from the video taken over England on Burnham-on-the-Sea on February 11th, 2009. Next. Now this is something interesting that I feel, or have the theory, that the ancient British actually copied the UFOs. The archaeological structures are carved in the ground in England. There's dozens of them, and these structures are over a mile long. Next. And this is how they're made. These ditches are carved out, and if you think about the type of energy that it takes to make what amounts to is a 2-mile around section of these ditches, the British archaeologists call them cursus because they remind them of kind of a racetrack. But I suggest that they in fact show that the craft had been there in ancient times. Next. There's another picture of one, the Stonehenge cursus, and you see outlined on the ground. And this is right in the Stonehenge area. Next. This is one of the typical disc-shaped craft. Next. And they built these huge hills in England. The question is, why were they built? It happens that the disc-shaped aircraft seem to be able to power up by the energy inside the hills and the electrical energy coming down. Next. We feel that it's something like the cargo cult in World War II. The natives in the South Pacific made shapes of aircraft on the ground, and that the British in the ancient times may have done the same thing. Next. This is one of the better craft pictures taken in Cumberland, Rhode Island on July 3rd, 1967, and this was colorized and the windows put in. Next. One Navy Chief Petty Officer, flight engineer with 10,000 hours, had also seen a UFO, and he said that the cigar-shaped craft was twice the size of 2 aircraft carriers. Next. And the object moved east at about 100 knots and was a huge aircraft. A similar one was seen by 2 pilots on 2 different airlines over the English Channel on April 23, 2007. Next, Captain Ray Bauer in his Ernie aircraft, and a Blue Island pilots had seen these UFOs and reported them.
Major, you have a little bit less than a minute left.
Okay. Here's Captain Bauer reporting it in 2007. Next. And here's a close-up of one taken in France just recently. In any case, these spacecraft occasionally roam our skies. They're seen by many people, by many pilots and air crews, and I think they've been here for thousands of years, and our ancestors made structures on the ground to remind us that they had actually been here. And I've been interested in UFOs ever since, and I'd like to dedicate this talk to my 2 daughters that recently passed away. Thank you.
We could next go to Mr. Jim Courant.
Yes, wanted to thank all the serious researchers that have been trying to get this information out for years, and thanks for you all showing up today. And my background is I've been a pilot started taking lessons when I was 10 years old. I've been an airline captain for 31 years, flying 46 years, and have over 32,000 flight hours, rated as a captain 747s and most Boeing jets and Airbus. I'm also a helicopter instructor and instructor in gliders and balloons and such. Got interested in this subject in 1962 when I was reaching for a book on flying in a small library, and a book fell out called Flying Saucers Top Secret by Major Donald Kehoe. And he was one of the ringleaders in helping get a lot of this information out. And most of his books are credible, professional people that were, people that were trained to know what they were seeing, pilots and astronomers, ground observers, such. And I thought it was science fiction when I first picked it up. So that's how I got started in this field. And it has not been an easy field. Unfortunately, after all these years, it still hasn't changed much. I wish it had, as far as military or civilian pilots, of how they're treated as far as when they see something. Give you an example of things that are seen but not talked about. A friend of mine was a flight engineer, 747, with an air carrier I was flying for at the time, and they were over the Pacific, and they had a similar sighting to what happened with the Japan Airlines flight in 1986, but this was in 1980. There was no radar, and my friend came up to me later after his trip, and he said, "You won't believe what we saw. This thing was bigger than a aircraft carrier." And he said, we were obviously flying a 747. They were heading to Narita. They were told to park the aircraft when they got there, and then they were debriefed, told never to talk about it. There are many cases like this of pilots coming up to talk to me because they know I've kind of stuck my neck out more than most pilots because of I've been very lucky to make some contacts with different people around the world that should know what they're talking about. Some of them were astronauts, some cosmonauts, some generals, and I usually don't get into what I've been told, and they tell me what they know in closed-door sessions, and it's almost verbatim what I've been told before. It's almost astounding how many people are in the know on this subject, and and just, they're afraid. And it's not so much I find out afraid for losing their retirement and such, some of them are, or their status in life, but they're more afraid for their families. So I'm not going to get in too much into that aspect, but what happened to me as far as I had a sighting over New Mexico, 1995. Ironically, I had just finished talking to my first officer about this subject, which I had been told sometimes it wasn't a good idea. He said, I've been flying 25 years, I've never seen anything. He was an ex-military tanker pilot. And his lips had barely stopped moving when the cockpit, it was at dusk, so it was starting to get dark. The cockpit started almost getting the shade of bluish green. I look off to the left, and I thought the air traffic controllers had misinformed us about any traffic nearby. It looked a lot closer than it was. It was oval-shaped, bluish green, moving very quickly, and they had no radar contact on this, military or civilian. We were just about 100 miles past Albuquerque. I looked to my first officer. He looked like he had just found out his wife was having an affair. And the typical scenario with this is we got on the ground. Well, there were 4 other airliners in the area. The controller asked, does anybody want to report it? And they said, no, it's just a meteor. And we had seen like a flash of white light, and the thing took off at about a 45-degree angle back into space. And I chimed in on the radio. I said, when does a meteor go back up? So when we got to the ground, he didn't want to talk about it, didn't want to report it, and he never flew with me again. But this is a sad scenario because this happens so much. Pilots come up and tell me what they've seen, many in areas over the ocean where there is no radar. And some of these fighter pilots are pretty brave guys. They fought in wars, and yet they're afraid of mentioning this, mostly for fear of ridicule. I have been invited in to talk with a small group of high-level people, a couple of senators, and Gordon Cooper, the astronaut, one of our original 7, and Edgar Mitchell are friends of mine, and I'm really proud of the effort they've put out trying to get this information out, because it is very hard to get to the truth on this subject, which is ridiculed so much, but it's also so hard to get to the proof, and that's what everybody's after. And I have found out why this proof is so hard to get after, and there's so much more I could share, but when you're down to just a few minutes, you have to almost be a top 40 disc jockey to get through this.
But you got a couple more minutes, so please tell us that.
3 minutes. One thing, you'd think the government doesn't take this seriously. I don't know if you've heard about this book. I told the History Channel about it back when it first came out. It first came out in '78, but in 1992, the second edition came out, and they added the section. This is the Fire Officer's Guide to Disaster Control for our federal and civilian fire disaster people for atomic wars or whatever, and how to deal with it. It's written by ex-Navy personnel. One's an attorney, one's a PhD. And the main section that they revised in 1992 was on the UFO threat, a fact. And it tells the firefighters, who are usually first on the scene, how to deal with a crashed UFO, possibly dead extraterrestrials or live ones, and how to deal with the crowd situation, radiation problems, and that's that information. So it's a very interesting addition that they added in 1992 on this book. There are some very important books that people always ask me, because after I got involved talking about this subject to some co-pilots, I was turned in and I was evaluated for four days of flight testing, and everything went smooth. And in fact, the chief pilot said, well, you got through okay, you get to keep your job, and I'm very interested in the subject now. It looks like there's more to this than I thought. So we used to have long talks about this. And through that situation. I was so upset about my freedom of speech rights after how I was treated as a pilot, and other pilots around the world have been treated, that I ended up getting the opportunity to do a 5-day-a-week live uncensored television show for almost 3 years. And we did just a little over 500 shows on this subject and other mysteries that I found out regarding the UFO subject is basically the tip of the iceberg. This stuff gets very deep, and I can understand, just like Stanton Friedman has said many, many times, of the reasons why this has been kept secret. It's much more involved than people realize who don't do their homework, because most people are so busy getting their kids to school, paying their mortgage, and their own box of reality, that a person convinced against their will is of the same opinion still. And all we can do is just keep trying, and hopefully the press will have more serious articles, and the articles have been published this week, unfortunately, that are put a bad frame on the seriousness of this subject.
You've got about 30 seconds.
And I hope the pilots of the world that are listening will not be afraid to tell what they see and not fear the ridicule, because this has got to end after so many years of this. But once again, I do recommend, if somebody is interested in this subject, I always recommend Richard Dolan's books, excellent research, Linda Moulton Howe's books, Stanton Friedman's books, Timothy Good's book called Above Top Secret, and Brad Steiger's book, The Rainbow Conspiracy, and also Michael Hesselman's book, The Secret History of UFOs. There are many others. I have a collection of over probably 3,000 UFO books at my house and hundreds of videos. We all can't be crazy. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Now, let's see. Now, if we could hear from Lieutenant Colonel Richard French.
I am Lieutenant Colonel Richard French. I was a fighter pilot in both Korea and Vietnam. During a number of my flights, of mine, I have a little trouble reading this because it's been freehand written and I'm having a little trouble picking it up. Witnesses to the sightings of a number of UFOs. I'm going to go to the first one that stands out most in my mind. I was at Spangdahlem, Germany, when I received a telephone call from the OSI district commander telling me to go investigate a reported UFO in the water in Newfoundland. Approximately 4 hours later, I arrived to find a large crowd on the wharf, and there were divers in the water. The water was very clear. You could see down as much as 200 feet in it. But what I saw down there were 2 UFOs parked side by side, but I couldn't see anyone around either one of them. Then a little later, someone moved to one of the UFO occupants, and I guess go ahead and call them what they are, the alien, moved over to the side and came into my line of sight. Very soon after that, he came out of the water going approximately 100 miles an hour. As soon as he broke the surface of the water, he increased his speed to approximately 2,500 miles an hour and quickly went out of sight. He was gone for about 15 or 20 minutes. He came right back, went and slowed down very much, went in the water again at about 100 miles an hour, went on down and he and the other one, you could see them working on the UFOs. They, after about approximately 2 hours of apparently performing maintenance on the UFOs, the 2 of them took off together again, left the water at about 100 miles an hour, immediately accelerated to well over 2,500 miles an hour, went virtually straight up and disappeared. The speeds that I report in this, I arrived at the figures simply by triangulation. And in that, I could take things that were at a known distance and then calculate based on where they were and how long it took them to get to another place is what I use as a standard for saying for estimating their speed. In another instance, I was on my way to Libya. I was out over the water just about 3 miles offshore of the northern extreme of the Mediterranean Sea. I looked up to my left, and 5 miles away I saw a lighted UFO. It went down into the center of Mount Blanc, if you know where Mount Blanc is in France. Anyway, it went down into the center of Mount Blanc, was down there for approximately 15 minutes, and turned around and came right back out. Since then, I have noticed that there's something about the inside of volcanoes that seems to attract them. And in discussing that with other people, we reached this conclusion that whether it's right or wrong, this is the closest we can get to a logical reason for why they do that. They may very well be and have been for some time actually defending the Earth, because what other purpose would they have for it? But we have no way of knowing whether they are doing something constructive, because I'm certain that they wouldn't risk their equipment and lives and like that if they didn't have a useful purpose for it. I just mentioned on others, I saw the same thing in Hawaii, and again, the live volcano at Kilauea, which I'm sure you're familiar with. But anyway, they went down inside of that. I saw them again when I was down in Sicily, and they went down inside of the volcano that's you know, the famous one that has, when it erupted, it lay waste to about 100 square miles of land. In all cases, the UFOs, they've all been the same shape. They've all been the cigar-shaped type. And in all cases where I was able to see the aliens, they were what we call grays, who you've probably heard them mentioned by other people that are reporting in this same convention. The last that I personally witnessed happened right in Sedona, where I lived quite recently. And what happened, I used to go out in the early evening, I'd go out on my back patio and, you know, look at the stars, and the scenery in Sedona is spectacular, as you may know if you've been there. But anyway, I saw this one go by, but when it went by, I didn't think it was a UFO. the thing I thought was that it was simply a meteorite. But, you know, I watched it, it went from north to south and disappeared, and I thought, well, that's a meteorite. And I believed that until the thing turned 180 degrees and flew back. Well, that immediately convinced me that that was something that meteorites don't normally do. And that concludes my speech, gentlemen.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Colonel. Mr. Steve Allen, would you proceed?
Thank you. Good morning, distinguished members of the panel. Greetings from the Lone Star State. Thank you for taking time to investigate. I hope it'll be rewarding. My name is Steve Allen. Please forgive me, I'm not a public speaker, so I'll do the best I can. In fact, I'm just an old country boy, so bear with me. I live near Stephenville, Texas. I'm the owner of a transportation company. I'm a private pilot of an aircraft, been flying most of my life. I'm a witness to what I feel and others have said could very well be the most significant sighting in history. Why, you ask? Several reasons. Multiple witnesses, including business owners, former FAA air traffic controllers, ranch, and law enforcement. There have been multiple witnesses of events in the past, but this time, well, you know, many may not remember all details, distort the facts, and even lie to you. But this time there is a very comprehensive radar report compiled from several government radars. The radars have no hidden agenda and no emotion. It simply reports what it sees. Here's my story. On the evening of January the 8th, 2008, at 6:15 p.m. in Selden, Texas, just outside of Stephenville, at my friend's home, Mike Odom, I witnessed a set of 4 very bright, high-intensity lights flying extremely fast in a very low altitude. What seemed to be coming directly at us, flying from east to west. I knew immediately this is nothing I had ever seen. I paid very close attention to all details. I had a feeling this would be a historic event. The object appeared to be very large, about a half a mile wide and close to a mile long. The lights came past us at approximately 3,000 feet AGL. That's above ground level. It was up close and personal. This was not something way out in the heavens, but it was right there before our eyes. It was totally silent, made no wind noise, no engine noise, nothing. As the aircraft traveled past us, I had a strange feeling they were aware we were watching them and they were aware of us as well. Never had had that feeling before. Also, as the object passed by us, you could see 7 extremely bright lights in the rear of the craft, all in a horizontal fashion, blinking in no particular order. The object came to a complete stop over Stephenville, Texas, about 3 to 4 miles away. The 7 lights reconfigured into an arch shape, like the top of a football, then to a vertical shape. Then in a split second, they duplicated with 2 sets of 7 lights. Then another brief moment, they burst into light-colored flames, almost white in color, which looked to be contained in a large box or a rectangle shape. Then about 3 or 4 seconds later, they simply disappeared. Did not streak off in the distance, but simply disappeared. I was amazed. One of the members of our party, a rural mail carrier named Lance Jones, abruptly left the scene after the event. All to our disbelief, we ran into my friend's home, Mike Odom, which had witnessed the event as well, and told his wife, Claudette. She doubted us and wanted to call Lance Jones, the mail carrier, to verify our story. We invited her to do so. Claudette telephoned Mr. Jones, and he instructed us to run back outside and it was coming back. We bolted out the door. Sure enough, this time the object was traveling from west to east at a very high rate of speed. But I could hear the roar of jets in the immediate distance. Then a moment later, sure enough, the object had 2 F-16s in hot pursuit, full afterburner. The flames were protruding from after the aircrafts. They were down on the deck and very close to us. They shook the ground and rattled the windows. The object was much closer than first sighted moments before. We stood there silently in amazement and watched the object with the jets chasing speed off over to the distance into the horizon. The next morning, I reported the event to my local airport where I hangar my aircraft. After they made several calls, they were unable to find out anything. Then I contacted the local newspaper, like opening a Pandora's box. That's when the world found out about the event. I made the dire mistake of putting my telephone number in the article. I received many phone calls daily, with no less than 60 calls per day from actual witnesses. All of the people that had witnessed the event, some were willing to come forward with their story and some would not. In the next few days, we were all on the local news channels, CBS, NBC, ABC, Fox. But then 4 days after the event, Larry King Show. And several days after that, O'Reilly Factor, Good Morning America, Primetime, Peter Jennings, just to name a few. National Geographic, History Channel, Discovery Channel, just to name a few more, made productions centered around the event. In the early stages, Angela Joyner from the local newspaper, Empire Tribune, or ET for short, how ironic, contacted Major Carl Lewis at the Naval Air Station Joint Reserve Base in Fort Worth. He consistently denied any of the aircraft in the area and attempted to explain it away. He offered several possible scenarios, but none were plausible. 10 days later, lo and behold, a press release stating they did in fact have 10 F-16s in the area. Then came Robert Powell and Glenn Schultz. They filed several Freedom of Information Act documents. They compiled the radar data hits in the millions in the Schultz-Powell report. Sure enough, a very detailed, comprehensive report emerged. There it was, an unidentified aircraft with no transponder traveling from east to west at 1,900 to 2,100 miles an hour. Then in less than 10 seconds, slowing to a speed of less than 50 miles an hour over Stephenville, Texas. What could do this? Then the object reversed course and traveling from east to west with the 2 F-16s in pursuit. What else did the radar report show? Well, 8 additional F-16s, 4 F-16s on either side of the aircraft attempting to flank the object. Also an AWACS, Airborne Weather Command Center. That's the aircraft with the giant Frisbee-like radar on its rear at 41,000 foot, circling the area for over 4 hours. Powell and Schultz also received copies of the F-16 logbooks. Many had been redacted to cover up what? The craft ended up 10 miles from the former President Bush's Western White House in Crawford, Texas. Then we had no more radar info. We do not know. All I do know is what I observed this event, well, did not need to be a trained observer, a pilot, or anything else to describe it. A first grader could have reported this. To me, all this is very concerning. It has forever been etched into my brain, has affected my life in many ways, mostly for the good. More questions than answers. What could have outperformed our best aircraft? Why were they chasing it with vengeance? It is a danger to myself or others while flying. Do they mean us harm? I think we all have more questions than answers. Myself and the public respectfully demands answers. Hopefully you will be able to help us.
Okay, well, thank you very much, witnesses. We'll have 10 minutes for questioning from each member of the panel. And if any would like to reserve some of their time on the first round, we'll hopefully get 2 rounds in, if it's possible. Mr. Callahan, I'd like to start and ask you a little more context on that meeting in the FAA. Where was it and what was the year? You mentioned the Reagan administration. I'd just like to put this, your testimony, a little more context so I understand it just a little bit better.
Well, at FAA headquarters, 800 independents, the administrator's on the 10th floor. On the 10th floor, he has what we call a round room, similar to what the president has. and he had set up a meeting for us to go at that, in that room. It also had a big TV screen that comes out of the wall, so it's similar to what you have up here. And the people that were there were the 3 scientists, the 3 CIA guys, a bunch of grunts. I brought up 22 experts from the area. They watched the video, and I've got the original copy of the video here in case you guys are ever interested.
Okay.
I've
So
got the voice tapes from the military.
there were probably, what, about, you'd say 30 to 40 people in attendance at that?
Yeah, that's
Briefing.
pretty close, yeah.
And let me ask you this question. When was the first time, that happened, which year? 80?
88, I guess, 86.
86,
I
okay.
retired in 88.
When, if you can remember, and approximations are just fine here, when was the first time you were able to, or that you felt comfortable, or in fact, under any circumstance, talk about this openly to, and let people know what you witnessed at that briefing?
Well, I don't have any problems being comfortable anytime I'm talking.
So you did it immediately, I take it?
Yeah, my wife is one of those engineers, software engineers, and after I spoke to the administrator on the way home, I told her what we had seen up at Lang City. I played the tape at home, and she's one of those guys, if you asked her what time it was, she'd tell you how to build a watch first. Well, she's watching the TV screen at home, and she's telling me what we're looking at and how that target got there and got there.
So besides your wife, who else did you tell about this event? And let me just preface that with, were you asked by anybody there, CIA, the 3 CIA gentlemen, not to talk about the briefing, or?
Well, they made a comment, but they were talking to the people I brought up.
So in other words, okay.
As far as I was concerned, they weren't talking to me.
I understand.
outranked them and,
Okay. Okay, I appreciate that. I'd like to just ask Jim Courant to follow up a few questions on what you testified. Let's see, the sighting you had was in 1995, I understand.
Yes.
Did you have any other sightings in was it 40 years experience as an airline pilot that you mentioned, or 30 to
Yeah,
40
I've
years?
been flying as an airline pilot since 1971.
So over 40 years experience. Any other sightings?
Yeah, there were, it was unusual, but at 2 different locations a week apart in the middle of the night. And both times I had 2 different co-pilots, and they were ironically both ex-tanker pilots, so they knew what a tanker operation looks like at night. And we were, probably around 35,000 feet, 32,000 the other incident. One was over Montana, one over Georgia. 2 in the morning, the first one, a little past 3:30 in the morning, the other one. Both times, no radar contact. They were, ironically, very similar. I'd never heard of these type shapes before as far as that high up, but in my research. But they were like glowing orbs, 3 of them in formation, and they were just hovering. And we're cruising along about 450 miles an hour, and like I said before, I'm a helicopter instructor, so obviously a helicopter can't hover that high. But I must say, with all this, most of what people are seeing are aerial phenomena, maybe black projects from our government. So a very small
You think it might be able
percentage.
to be explained?
It could be something, of course, this was back in would have been 1985, or actually it was around 85, 86. But we didn't have these drones like we have now, but I don't even think they fly that high. But these things were just hovering there, stationary, and then they just slowly turned to the left and started flying off. And both times when we asked the controllers, do you have anything on the radar, and we show no traffic in your area. Our TCAS, which is our traffic avoidance system, never
Right,
went
but-
off.
And I just, well, I'm going to get back to this radar question, but I'd like to reserve the balance of my time
Okay.
to ask questions. So I'd like to call on Representative Woolsey to take this.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Major Filer.
Yes.
This is just a out-of-the-blue question, but I'd like to hear your perspective on it, and if any of the rest of you have ideas about this. Both, two questions. One, could a UFO, like a drone, be controlled from the ground electronically? Or, two, could UFO materials be developed here in the United States or on Earth and tested against our military?
Well, I think
Okay,
it's
go.
possible both are true.
Pardon?
Ben Rich at Lockheed indicated that so many words we had back engineered some of these craft and we're now able to take ET home. The point is that apparently we're able to do a lot of things now. And probably some of what we're seeing is our own UFOs, so to speak.
Well, okay, now, but do you think we're learning from the UFOs and then we're building because of, I mean, or are we, was that us in the first place?
Well, in a sense, I think anything's possible, but I also believe that we're being visited.
Anybody else have a thought on that? I mean, you know, maybe we're way more clever than any of us realize. And my question would be, and it's just a pushback on making sure we've covered all ground, are Earthlings setting this up in the first place? You know, so that we find our way to outer space and for what could come with wars in outer space. Or are the non-Earthlings coming to us and showing us what they know, and we're realizing we've got to compete?
It's a good question, what you asked, because I never heard that before. The people I talk to that have been involved in the reverse engineering, they call it, with the UFOs that they captured, they could, by now, because it's been, 30 years or more, they could have developed a ship that they could be out practicing with, or a group of ships. If you remember Dr. Mitchell, when he spoke, he said when he was en route to the moon, he looked out the left portal, I would have called it a window, and he called down to NASA and said, "I'm now a fighter too." He thought that that spaceship flying along with them was made here in the United States, and they were flight checking it. So it is possible that the United States has been making these UFOs, but I don't think they're going to tell us. And it's just one of those, how do you really know?
Okay, anybody else? Yes, Mr. Allen.
2 points. Why would our jets be chasing it, and why would they let it out over a very densely populated area if it was ours?
Good questions, yes. Well, don't ask me, I'm asking you. I mean, why? Because possibly we want to find out if our military can keep up with
Could be a
what
test.
we've learned is out there, but
You would think they'd test it out in the desert somewhere where there's no observers and media attention.
right. But most of it has been over open space.
I would, the individual that gave me most of my flying lessons when I was younger was Triple H in World War II. 2 books were written about him, one by a general from the Air Force Academy. His name was Colonel Leroy Gover. And he was one of the first 100 American pilots in World War II. He went over to Canada and then became commander of Eagle Squadron. I knew him for 40 years. He was a pilot's pilot. And on his deathbed, 3 weeks before he passed on, I gave him a copy of Colonel Corso's book, The Day After Roswell. And he said, "I don't know a whole lot about certain aspects of this book, if it's all true, but I can tell you from what I was involved with, the people I knew, because he was with the Army Air Corps, which later the same year as the alleged incident in Roswell happened, the Air Force was formed along with the United Nations and other developments." But he confirmed that, in his words, and I never heard this man lie, he said they were androgynous. They didn't know their full technological capabilities at that time. At least one of them survived. They didn't know their full psychological makeup or where they were from or what this was all about. This was at this time. So that's just one other deathbed statement. He was a good friend, and so was Gordon Cooper, who basically made similar statements the years that I knew him.
So I'm going to ask a very short question of you, Jim, because it's appropriate at this point. And then I'm going to waive the rest of my time, or till later. Has your credibility been questioned because you were a believer before you were part of a sighting? People say, oh yeah, well, he wanted that to happen, so he made it happen in his mind.
Amazingly enough, that hasn't come up in discussion, but it's definitely something that I expected, but that hasn't been a problem.
Okay,
you know.
good. Thank you very much, and I'll yield for the time being.
Could we go to Representative Bartlett, please?
Thank you very much. Mr. Cullen, the event that you describe is exactly the kind of thing that I think is most creditable. Let me understand, how many different people saw this?
So the radar return?
Well, are there not people that saw the craft and people that saw the radar returns both?
No, the only ones that saw the craft was the Japanese pilot and the other two with him, his co-pilot.
Okay, so there were 3 people that saw the craft, all right. And how many people saw the radar?
No, 20, 30.
23
at the time,
people?
Yeah.
Yeah, these are the kinds of things that are just very difficult to explain away, where you have eyewitnesses and a radar track, and a real radar track. But apparently some of these things don't leave a radar track. The other day we had testimony from a pilot in South America that they can absorb bullets. Something that can absorb bullets can absorb radar, I would think.
Well, the radar picks up all the traffic, but most people don't understand how the system works, and that's what blows their mind. If you're an air traffic controller and you're working your sector in front of you, you've got 500 miles that you're taking care of. The antenna's going by every 9 or 10 seconds, and it picks up a primary target, which is the size of a pencil eraser, and it puts it on your scope right here. You could be working traffic going this way. When that target shows up, we don't know who it is, and you're going to look at that and say, well, if he gets close to this guy, I'll do something intelligent. And 10 seconds later, that target is over here someplace, nowhere near your traffic, so your mind says it must have been an 18-wheeler, it could be somebody low, I don't know what it was. The radar always picks up everything flying, but they go so fast that you don't recognize them. Today, to fly in the FAA system, if you're flying below 10,000, you have to stay at 250 knots. If you're flying above 10,000 or above 18,000, you have to have a working transponder on your aircraft. That sends out a signal to the radar that says, this is me, and it shows a different target on the screen. That's what we see when our people are flying. The UFOs don't have transponders, and they don't care about our rules and regulations. They come and go. I don't know how you're going to solve that problem.
Are these records now available?
I didn't hear you.
Are these records now available, or have they been taken somewhere, the radar tracks?
Oh, I've got a copy of it, of the video I took. I also had the engineers at the tech center produce this chart, and I've got the papers that you can have anybody that knows anything about automation. They could plot all the airplanes along the route of flight, and the engineers that did this, they wrote down that this is the first time the UFO showed up, the first time the military seen the UFO. The pilot at the 022706, NORAD called, they lost the target. They put 2 sheets of paper like this together on the board. They said, this is what happens. Now, when I was talking to the engineers, the hardware and software engineers, I asked them to tell me what the target was alongside the 747. And the hardware engineer says, that target right there is a software problem. This one's a software. All the way down, the targets that showed up were software problems. The software engineer gets up and says, this target here is a hardware problem. That's a hardware problem. So my question to them was, well, if it's not a hardware problem and it's not a software problem, then what the hell is it? What are we looking at? I'm still thinking it's a stealth bomber. And one of them, he says, my religion forbids me to believe in UFOs. So I said, well, how do you know it ain't a stealth bomber? They knew what they were looking at. They knew what they were putting down on the chart, and it was something that didn't belong here in the United States. But you won't see, if you go up and watch radar today, you won't see the UFOs he's shooting across the country. He has to slow down to somewhere around 600 knots, and then he would, if he stayed with the airline pilot, you would see the airline's target. The computer would tell you who it is, it's Transworld, whatever it is, what his speed was, what his altitude was as he's climbing and whatnot. All that data is on the screen, and next to it there'd be a dot. And unless the pilot said, hey, if you got somebody at my altitude, we would never know that that's what it was. If he stayed a little bit above that aircraft, he wouldn't see it, wouldn't give it any thought, we would not know. Once the pilot says, hey, there's somebody at my altitude here. If it was a Learjet or a military aircraft, had the pilot said, it looks like an F-106 playing games out here, we would have tracked that little dot all the way to he landed, and we would have wrote him up for flying and controlled airspace without the FAA's approval.
I think you've answered my next question. That was, how do those who say there is no such thing as this explain it away, and they're explaining it as either a software problem or a hardware problem, huh?
Well, that's what the engineers did.
I gather. Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Pfeiffer, the hills in England and the energy from the hills, can you explain that a bit?
Pardon me?
You mentioned hills in England and energy from the hills.
Yes, we've done some indication that the UFOs may need some kind of electrical and magnetic energy. And all over the world, there's pyramids or hills or mountainous terrain where they seem to be attracted to, and have often been reported in landing on top of these pyramids, that kind of thing. And we're assuming that they may use this as a power station. There's books out that indicate that the pyramids actually generate power, that they're power stations in some way. And for example, right now there's some 200 pyramids in China with flat tops to them, which make them ideal for a craft landing on them. And the Chinese are declaring that they're some 10,000 years old. And the question is, how did these huge pyramids be built when we were basically not much further along than cavemen?
Yeah, that's very interesting. Let me continue a little bit more with this, with Mr. Allen. You mentioned that that they just disappeared?
Yes, sir, just in a flash. It didn't streak off or anything, it simply disappeared.
And when you saw it take off, there was no propulsion sound, there was no wind sound?
Correct, no wind noise, no engine noise, nothing, and we was...
Has anybody speculated on how a large object like that could move so rapidly through the air and have no wind noise?
That's one of our questions, pure speculation.
Were these tracked by radar?
Yes, sir. Yes, that's a comprehensive radar report. I think you do have a copy of it.
So there's something tracked by radars, and people saw it, so you know it's there, and it moves very rapidly, and there's no propulsion sound, and there's no wind sound, no propulsion sound I understand, because we don't know how they propel themselves. If it's an anti-gravity thing or something, obviously there's going to be no propulsion sound, but you're going through the molecules. I don't understand that. Yes, sir, Colonel French.
I apologize for this because I had intended to discuss the Phoenix Lights, and by accident I stepped over that.
Go ahead and take the rest of my time to discuss the Phoenix Lights. Go ahead.
What happened? It happened in 1997. I was with 4 friends at and we were up at an area called the Boulders, which is in actually northern Scottsdale. And that was when the Phoenix Lights, were they were explaining what they were, was that they were actually targets for gunnery practice. Well, I knew better than that, and I was explaining to them why. Number one of those gunnery targets, they're a flare, and the flare burns for exactly 1 minute and 21 seconds. And another thing about them, a gunnery flare may go up or down. Now, the reason it would go up, it'll capture heat in the deployed area of the parachute, and it'll rise, or it won't capture enough air in it, and then it'll descend and sit. So I knew then they couldn't be that. And I'm telling to my friends, no, they got this all wrong. While I'm in the process of doing that, there was a low spot well, it's a mountain range, but it's not an extreme one. And this UFO came through that cut, and of course there was no lights on it that I could see at that point. When it went by, and now it's going at this time at about 50 miles an hour, and descending slowly and headed in the direction of Tucson to the south. Well, as it got past me and about probably 30 miles down, the lights out on the range, they didn't go out, they stayed on, but they started heading for Tucson. The UFO, now it went by, made absolutely no sound. It was less than 100 yards from me, and you could hear absolutely nothing, yet the vehicle was actually nearly a mile long and approximately 60 feet in diameter. Again, silent, totally silent. When it got in the vicinity of Tucson, the smaller UFOs that were reported to be parachute targets, they headed toward Tucson, and at that time I could see on the side of the UFO like little doors open. They entered the other, we call them motherships. Anyway, the smaller ones went into the motherships. The motherships went, when they got to Tucson, they very quietly disappeared, went right up and out and gone. Now,
Thank you. I think my time is consumed. Thank you so much. Thank you.
I commend you for going within the time. We'd like to.
And this is one where, of course, the governor denied that it happened, and then
I
he
see
reversed
the
himself.
sign just did go up. The time has expired, but thank you very much. And we'll go to Representative Hooley.
Oh, I'm sorry. First of all, thank you for your testimony. Jim, I'd like to ask you a question. Did people not talk about this because they were afraid for their families? When did you start talking to other people about what you saw and what happened?
Probably more after the TV show UFO Cover-Up Live in 1988. It was kind of the beginning of the, from what I understand, a slow education process for modern times of the public. And there's been, since then, it's been easier to talk about this situation with other crew members do come up. They've seen me on TV, and they say, I'm still afraid to talk about it, but let me tell you what happened to me, or my father when he was in the military, or this or that. But I'm glad that these shows through the last 20 years on Discovery Channel, Learning Channel, even the show recently that's a series, Ancient Aliens. If you look at things like the Ica stones of Ica, Peru, very fascinating case with the 50,000 Ica stones, amazing. I've traveled the world studying these things, and it just gets deeper and deeper and more amazing. But one of the problems with people not being able to accept this, even, and it is a major issue, is if these entities are getting here, which I, as a person, believe they are, based on my research, they've conquered gravity. Once you conquer gravity, you conquer everything. So there goes the fossil fuel-based, economy of the world, and we can go on and on. The religious issues are pretty relevant. But Carl Sagan, on his show Cosmos, he admitted with 200 billion stars out there, in the Drake equation, they must be out there, but they can't get here. And what's locking that problem is the theory of relativity with Einstein. So what you really have to kind of take a look is maybe there's something beyond the theory of relativity, and what's faster than the speed of light, thought. From what I understand from scientists that have been involved with these projects, is they're thousands of years ahead of us probably, and they've definitely used some kind of incredible thought process, some kind of inversion energy process to get here, and they basically warp time. So as profound as it sounds, if you'd told me that 10 years ago people would be bumping into themselves in an airport terminal like zombies looking down at these devices there, these cell phones, I wouldn't have believed it. And so anything's possible, but we do have, based on what I understand, an aircraft called a TR-3B. There's probably either many other advanced craft that we've developed at some of these installations like 51 or Pine Gap in Australia possibly, that do hover silently, and they can duplicate some of the technology, but we haven't been able to replicate it 100%.
Thank you. I don't know if anyone wants to volunteer for this question, but nobody talks about the sound. Are there no sounds that you heard when you saw a spaceship or saw a flying object? Did they make any sound? So you have to be, is that why more pilots have seen them than anyone else, because you're in the airspace with them? Yes,
I'd like to
Mr.
answer.
Pilot.
I'm with the MUFON organization, and we investigate these sightings, and we get about 1,000 sightings per month.
Per month, okay.
Per month. And actually, I write about it in my filer's files, which I'm happy to send to anyone. I'm sending out 17,000 emails a week discussing these sightings that we're getting. But generally, people say that there's no sound. Occasionally, when the UFO goes right overhead, they can see it go right overhead, just a few hundred feet above them, they'll hear what sounds like an electric motor.
Okay.
And that description has been given many times, sometimes a buzz sound, and very low, and obviously if you're in an aircraft you wouldn't hear it, or even if it's a little bit further away you wouldn't hear it. Point is that there apparently is, at least on some of the UFOs, a small, almost indistinct sound. And that's probably to do, like you mentioned, with the overcoming gravity. And it seems to have a lot of electrical energy surrounding it. And not only radar has picked it up, but other types of instruments. For example, just your typical compass that you can buy. In any case, the UFOs nearby, it will usually turn the compass to directly point towards them.
Can I give you just a little extra?
Of course.
Whenever I spoke, I was invited someplace to speak on TV, they always brought in this little Japanese guy who's on Channel 5, Michikuka or something like that. He would get up and explain how it's impossible to go from one planet to the other, and he would explain the thousands of light years. Now, a few months ago, he was on Fox News, and sitting behind him was a picture of the Earth. And they asked him what that was, and he says the Hubble telescope sent this picture back the other day, last week. He says this is a small planet similar to Earth. It has atmosphere, and it could probably have life on it. And if they were 1,000 years older than us, they may have developed some type of travel. A week or two later, he's back on there, and now there's a big Earth right behind him. Big Earth. He says, this planet came from the Hubble telescope. It is 100 times bigger than Earth, and it has atmosphere, and it could have life. And if they were 1,000 to 2,000 years older than us, they could have developed space travel, and they could do the wormholes, and they could go from place to place. And they said, well, what else does that tell you? He says, well, the biggest thing it tells us is that the universe goes on forever. Apparently, they had thought before it was like the Earth was flat, and eventually you would run out of the universe. But now he says it goes on forever. And there's 2 planets that they have identified through the Hubble telescope that have been there longer than us. So you might want to consider that.
That in your pipe.
Yeah, okay.
May I make one closing
Yes,
remark?
of course.
Had I came in here, I was not a skeptic when I came in here. I already believed in them. But I say very clearly that had I been a skeptic when I came in, I would have been convinced by the simple testimony of my cohorts.
Let me say that the testimony, I think, has been outstanding. And your backgrounds and where you come from, and the fact that you are willing to come forward and talk about this, I think is a credit to all of you, so thank you for doing that. I have 2 minutes left, and I'm going to reserve my time, Mr. Chair.
Okay. I'd like to ask Senator Gravel to...
I have 2 questions. One, when we look at the shape of the vehicles that have been observed, the 2 shapes stand out. One is something flat, like a disc, and the other is cigar-shaped. Could the cigar-shaped, which is, substantially different, could it be the angle of observation? Because if you observe a disc shape at a certain angle, it looks cigar-shaped. Could that be the case, and that we're talking more uniformly about disc shapes than disc and cigar shapes? Anybody could answer that.
One of the pilot reports was on the news for a while, but then the pilots were told to not talk about it. They never gave their names, but they were watching. They were thousands of feet in the air, 737, and out of the clouds came this giant, mile-long, cigar-shaped craft, and it was cigar-shaped. They aren't disc-shaped. So unfortunately, the pilots never wanted to talk about it again after it hit the news, and they played their voice tapes over the television, and they took some heat for it. But thank God I've got Danny Sheehan over there to protect me as a good attorney in case I get in trouble here. Bless you.
You're talking about a cigar shaped of a mile long.
Yes,
Yeah.
we have dozens.
It couldn't
Photos.
be the confusion of a contrail, which could be a mile long.
No, and I know
No
these, you're hearing reports of, size of 3 aircraft carriers, or in my friend's case, when that, over the Pacific, they said it was the size of an aircraft carrier, and they're in a 747. Are they Looney Tunes? Are they pilots like, this movie Flight with with Mr. Washington? No, the pilots are very serious in their profession, and they know what they see. I can understand where it might look like a disc, but they usually know if it's oval-shaped, spear-shaped, or a mile long. That's a big exaggeration that a pilot wouldn't make.
I have a boyhood friend who was a captain in Pan Am and flew the largest of 4. But the other thing I want to touch on, which really doesn't surprise me, but maybe a little angers me, and that is the back engineering. And I think you referred to somebody from Lockheed or Grumman or a company saying that they back engineered what was the debris or whatever they got their hands on through the government, and they can take ET home. Okay, well, That sounds like an exaggeration to me, because if there's a company that's developed a propulsion system equal to what's been observed by all of our witnesses, then, and based upon Dr. Greer's testimony, we just alter life on this planet if that form of energy is known. So for somebody who's an engineer at a major contracting firm can boast to you or anybody that we can take ET home, then that son of a gun is denying the planet something very vital, and that's what angers me. So I question, I think it's boastfulness, but correct me. I give you the opportunity to correct me. Was the person who told you that they could take ET home, was he Looney Tunes, or was he a serious engineer, or was he just boasting in your judgment?
Well, he's worked for Lockheed. He was head of Skunk Works. He was in a very important position, and I have friends who were at the briefing where he said this, Jan Harzen, at UCLA, and he said it in front of, like 100 engineers. I don't know if he was bragging or not, but he said it very clearly.
Well, but the implications of that, now, I've met people in very high places that are Looney Tunes.
Well, I know.
So that's not a criteria of credibility. All that is that he's walking around or she's walking around. But the implication of that is what really must be focused on, is that if somebody who's in any responsible corporate activity, obviously funded by the government to some degree, and can make the statement with any degree of credibility that we can take ET home, then there's grounds for prosecution, or there's grounds for something. It doesn't strike me as a proper assessment. It strikes me as boastfulness, the bravado that exists many times with technicians or politicians. I just don't want to attack technicians.
Well, obviously what we're studying here has all kinds of implications. And one of the implications that was written about in the Air Force physics books that was taught at the Air Force Academy said that if these craft really exist, and I've seen them and everyone here has seen them, that much of what we have concerning our laws of physics, our laws of biology and so on, are probably incorrect. So you can see how it would affect the whole civilization if it was released to the public.
And I agree with that statement totally, and that's the reason why I question the statement that we can take ET home.
Can I give you one more thought? Assuming that the UFOs are there, are correct, they travel from one planet to the other. Where do they stop for a gas station? What do they do for oil? What do they do for medical, for the people that's there? My own personal thing, there's enough people here in the United States or on this planet that would not want the rest of the people to know how they could get this free power and the better medical stuff. So some of that's kept aside also. The companies or the corporations or whoever's in charge, they're not going to want you to know that you can take a toaster and give New York City all the power they want. They don't want you to know that. They're selling their product, and they got to keep control of their product. Look at what we're paying for gas today, almost $5 a gallon.
Yeah, I found... Jim, please.
The man that the world doesn't give enough credit to that started this in the late 1800s is Nikola Tesla. And you look, he's almost like Forrest Gump. He was everywhere, working with Edison and Alexander Graham Bell and Einstein, and they finally gave him credit for inventing the radio over Marconi. I'm sure they're going to give him credit for television, radar, but we would not have the world we have today without his invention of alternating current. But somebody starts needing to educate the kids in college and the world a little better, other than that very good show on PBS of the man who created lightning. and give this man, whoever he was, credit for the world he brought us. Nikola Tesla, start doing some homework on him.
Yeah, Nikola Tesla had over 2,000
Wait a second. We can't hear you over the applause. Please start again.
I say Nikola Tesla had over 2,000 U.S. patents. And shortly after World War II, the Russians took all of those away.
I would only respond to what you had said, John. That was that I found in my life and in my career that there are more conspiracies than people are aware of, but there are less conspiracies than people think. It sounds like an oxymoron, but it is. We can, and of course the audience reacted to your statement in that regard. Sure, there's conspiracies. We know it all the time where new technology is bought up by a corporation because it impacts, and we know that the corporate interest is more interested in maximizing the profits from what they already have in place. We see this with refineries that should be shut down, but they're still making money with them, and they're not going to build a new one because they got the old one that they're making more profit on. But you come to the reality, and this is where I come back. Something as significant as the unknown, the scientific unknown, and the lack of rationale we have to understanding fully what these ETs are all about, and primarily the propulsion. We've seen testimony. It may be thought. What I don't know. I'm not enough scientist. I defer to my colleague, Congressman Barrett, who's a lot more educated in that area. But he comes up with the same queries. I notice our questions are very similar in that regard. But I just want to underscore.
Excuse me, but with all due respect, the gentleman's time has expired.
Well, fine. Good. Thank you.
We could go to Representative Kilpatrick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I came to this conference at the invitation of Citizen Hearing to find out more about the world and the universe. When I first got the letter inviting me to participate, I did my homework and looked at the 1968 report of the Science Committee in the United States House of Representatives. Read it, was real briefed on it, and thought it was a beginning. Did not confirm, but had a lot of evidence that something else is among us. So I thought I'd better look earlier and look more into that. When my local newspaper decided to publish it, I agreed to participate. It even opened wider from people I did not know and from around this country and out of the country. Some cynics, but mostly scientists and intelligent people who, after years of watching the phenomenon and participating in it, came to the conclusion that there is something and that we ought to look into it. So I agreed to come. When I came in on Monday, now Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and now Friday, from 9 to 5, I heard some of the most intelligent, the most scientific, the most universal knowledge on the topic that I didn't know I was going to witness. So when I came in here today, and mockery is being made of it, I'm disturbed. I think it's unfortunate. Yesterday we heard from 12 different countries who have hundreds of years of scientific, intelligent information on this subject. They mentioned another 12 or 13 that weren't here yesterday, but also believe. It behooves us as human beings in what is known as the greatest country in the world to participate in that discussion. Not just to seize or to take, but to participate and find out what it is. As a grandmother of 6, 2 sets of twins, I want them to have the kind of world that we've enjoyed all my 60-plus years. And to not act like something exists, and then further to act like it's a joke, we do a disservice to our ancestors, to God, and to the people of the world. So I'm very new at this. I served 18 years in Michigan State House and 15 years in this Congress. Now here sitting with you, I'm a high school teacher, 2 children, 6 grandchildren. I want the world and the universe to continue. And if there is something out there, and I'm not a scientist, I have a master's degree from the University of Michigan. I'm learned, as you would call it. But there's a whole lot we don't know. I think it's ignorant of any people not to seek out what we need to know to continue the universe. I was convinced before this morning's panel that there probably is something out there. And I'm willing to work the rest of my life to see that if it is, and how we can enhance the universe to see that we all have a better quality of life. As an appropriator on the House committee here and the first African-American woman to serve on appropriations in Michigan for 18 years, and 12 of my 14 years here in Congress on the Money Committee, this federal budget is almost $4 trillion. The defense budget is $700 billion of that. I served on that appropriations bill for many, many years. Much has been said already. That's why I'm giving you this, because I want to bring it back to what I came here for. I don't want to leave it with some yellow guy with stuff sticking out of his head. It's way more serious than that. I can't laugh. I haven't laughed at anything in here because nothing's funny to me. I don't mean today. I mean all week. It's very serious. The world is in peril. Our country is economically, socially, and economically at a disadvantage right now. But we fix that by being partners in what we believe is correct and what issue you pick to work in. And not to put down historical data that's scientifically proven. You may not believe it, but don't work in that era. Don't come in here and just castigate those who do. That's what's wrong with our nation, I think, in our country, in our world. We don't work well enough together. If someone doesn't look like we look or think like we think something's wrong with them, rather than grabbing it and let's enhance what we already know. You know, I think I'm going to, Jim Courant, that's my editorial, and I think being last I could say that because you guys have kind of disturbed me this morning. I think the citizens' hearing on disclosure is real. I thought before today that most of you thought that too. When 2 or 3 people can come in the room and change a very intelligent subject such as this to something other than what it is, that does a disservice to our country and to our world. I think Mr. Courant, if I'm pronouncing that right, Courant, you said something about proof. What is the proof? We've been sitting here for 10 hours a day and some people half the night discussing the scientific proof that's been revealed. You sound very learned in the subject, but I'm not sure. Do you believe in UFOs? Is there an extraterrestrial presence in the world? Ought we be more involved in that?
Well, I've still got 3 years left to fly, so.
And I'll let you answer that yes or no, because the time has expired. I hate to say.
Oh.
5 minutes.
Yeah,
Hold up
get
the-
your
thank
cards
you.
straightened out, please, in the back.
If you want me to stop, I can
You've
stop.
got, no.
And I'm not going to quit the issue in the process either. so,
Representative,
you know.
I apologize. I was looking, well, actually, the timekeeper needs to actually apologize. But you do have 5 minutes
One thing
remaining.
we know as human beings, really, and certainly leaders of the world, and I consider myself one of those. When somebody doesn't want something to go on, it's a way to stop it, and really, I will yield. I don't have to keep talking. If you give me my 5 minutes, just a minute, and if you're going to be sarcastic, don't answer. Just let me go. Let me
I
go.
would like to
okay?
just remind the panel that there are enough members that have reserved time that there will be a second round. Now, not all members have reserved time, but you have that opportunity if you'd like.
Can I point out something that was offered in evidence yesterday and has not been discussed at all, and I find it absolutely fascinating? The thing, the commodity that we have the most of on Earth is water. Do you remember the lady saying we can turn water into food, we can turn water into fuel, and listed a whole bunch of things. And when you say, you know, that our planet is disappearing or these problems, there was an answer that it wasn't even discussed. Thank you.
Ted Koppel once said on his ABC News show, which I thought was a very good statement in my opinion, is who's the most wonderful and greatest extraterrestrial never seen, and that was God. And it's a big universe out there. And so the proof as far as can you as far as how they're getting here and their craft and that type of thing. This gets deeper than that, and I have run into people that probably have the proof you're talking about, but they're not going to risk their security clearance or whatever else they're risking, their families for one, to make that possible. But I would say the reason I've stuck in this so long and stuck my neck out so far is not just about losing the career, but it's because there are certain things that I've been privy to keep me going, but at this point I can't get into that. But and I
we
wish I
respect
could.
that. We do, and there have been some military men who've come to this table this week
But
at
the
peril
proof
to their
is,
own.
there's
existence.
people out there that have the proof you're looking for, but it's, we're talking on a need-to-know basis, very, very high security clearances.
Absolutely. National security is first, should be. I understand that. And then I was going to say that the military people who came before us, and just coincidentally, they were all men, but I know that there are many. I served for this room. It seems like a different room than the other 4 days.
And I'm not trying to take anything away from the intel field or the military officers that are been involved with this. They're doing their orders. This from what astronaut Gordon Cooper told me, they started these lies in '47 after Roswell, and Roswell wasn't the first.
Okay.
But,
let me reclaim my time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just lastly from me. Someone mentioned maybe it was our UFOs, which said to me, and I think it's one of the two of you guys, gentlemen, that it might have been one of our UFOs, which says to me, America's UFOs. Does America are producing UFOs to confuse the cosmos, or what? One of you said it. Either I'm not sure if it was you, Major, or I think it was Major. Did you say that, or it might have been the gentleman on the end?
I think I said it also, is that it could be ours because they've been doing reverse engineering for 30, 40 years now, and there's no telling what they've developed. I don't think anybody here is
So there
involved.
might be an existence that we're creating also out there. And I'm not saying that's good or bad. I just want to make sure I was understanding. That's
Well,
what was
That's what
said.
I'm saying, because they say out in the Area 51, they do have ships that come up from,
Sure.
and down, so, yeah, we probably have them.
Okay. One thing, and I'm going to end on this, that came out in the scientific, intelligent discussions and testimony and lectures that we've heard this week is that whatever's out there, extraterrestrial, UFOs, and I haven't yet defined the difference. I know some similarities, some differences, is way more intelligent than our technology today, can do more. The ships, the UFOs speeding up and stopping and turning and all the things that we haven't yet mastered that. That doesn't mean that we can't or that it doesn't exist. It just means that we have more work to do, and we have it more to do universally. Thank you very much.
Actually, 4 members, including Representative Kilpatrick, you've got a minute if you'd like to use that. Okay. 3 members then have reserved time. If I could add, let's see, this is a correct indication of the time. Okay. Representative Woolsey, you have 4 minutes. Representative Hooley, you have 2. I happen to have 5. Not because I'm the chair, but because I reserve that much.
Before you go on, I have to take a quick break. I'll be back in 3 seconds.
And you better hurry, because one of my important questions is going to you, sir, so, but I certainly will, right. And good. I'll reserve a minute or 2 if he's not back. Steve Allen would like to talk to you about, now you're a pilot, and you've done a lot of flying, but the thing you observed, the incident you observed, you were on the ground at the time.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes.
And a whole lot of people in Stephenville saw what you saw. It's obvious from your testimony.
Yes, close to 200 witnesses.
And there were was that what was established?
I believe so, yes.
Okay, and the F-16s that you say pursued whatever that object was also seen by how many people? How about, what,
I'm not sure the number on that one. There was several, though, quite a few.
right, okay, and do we have, is there, and I know there were newspaper reports of exactly what you've said. Was there radar involved in that one?
Yes, radar reports show the F-16s in pursuit.
Well, they show the F-16s. Did radar play any role, as far as you know, as you've thought about and studied this afterwards and heard about it, in the initial determination that they needed to send F-16s up and chase it and find, in other words, well, was radar involved in the object itself, is what I'm asking, at any stage?
I don't feel like it was, no, sir.
It's probably not. And, okay, that's consistent with what a lot of the people have observed and all, well, and let's see, now, was radar, Jim Carant, involved in either of the incidents? I think one was in '95, the others were earlier, about 10 years earlier.
Yeah,
Was radar involved in any of those?
there was no radar contact, and we
Okay.
had no TCAS warning, the traffic controls, air traffic control warning system in the aircraft did not go off.
And I thought John Callahan had some pretty good information on why radar might not be involved. But the question I wanted to ask him, and I'll ask you in just a second. Well, I'll ask you right now. I'll ask anybody right now.
Well, I've had a,
If radar is not involved, does that lead less credence to the idea that there might be an extraterrestrial origin then?
Not
If radar
necessarily.
is involved?
Well, obviously, we have stealth technology now. Where that came from, I'm not going to speculate on, but I know they just had a sighting, it's in the news this week, Airbus aircraft, British, coming into Glasgow, Scotland, December 2nd, and it just broke in the news yesterday or 2 days ago, and they were at 4,000 feet, and this disc-shaped thing came under them with the, strange lights and all that, and they never got any warning from their TCAS system, or it wasn't on radar. So this
And
is...
yes, Mr. Pryder, please.
Richard Haynes he's the ex-NASA expert on this, and all his books and studies for years are on pilot sightings, and one of the strangest cases was this Melbourne episode in 1978 where the pilot in a Cessna 182 disappeared after he was talking on to air traffic control about this craft coming down, bright light during the day, and they did have radar. Somebody got hold of the tapes from Pine Gap, Australia, our space monitoring agency down there, showing something coming at him, and then they never found any wreckage. He's never been heard from again. But Richard Haynes is the expert on pilot sightings. Read any of his books. If you're wondering about articles from around since the 50s, Rob Simone did an excellent job on UFOs and the headlines, real reporting on a real phenomena.
Okay, and I can see that my time is about expired.
Thank you.
If it, is it, yeah, it is expired. Yeah. So I'll go to, let's see, Representative Hooley. You have 4 minutes.
Mr. Chair, you wanted to ask a question of John Callahan? Is that correct?
I did, yes.
I will yield my time to you.
Well, thank you. Mr. Callahan, we've been talking about radar. You seem to know a lot about radar. Probably more about radar than any other expert we've heard this week. I think, and that's not just a compliment, I think it's a fact, from everything I've heard at least. The question I've asked is, you gave some, or repeat just very briefly, why you think radar does not show up in some of these sightings.
Well, the radar always shows up, but you can't see it. That's the problem.
Oh,
You
okay.
got to remember now, if a UFO or even a Russian or some other come into our airspace without a working transponder, then the computer would recognize that little dot that the radar picks up as nothing. And if it was a huge mass of raw radar, our system says it can't be an airplane it must be weather. So it puts it on what they call the WFMU, Weather Fixed Mapping Unit, and it tells the computer says, I'll put it on the scope as a cloud unless the controller says, I don't want to see the weather. And if that's the case, it never shows up.
Well, I'm glad I asked you this because, at least for my benefit, this has certainly illuminated the understanding. And so it would not be fair to say if something did show up on radar, that would be evidence that it was not ET. It would not be, that would not be a reasonable.
No, but you got to remember now, in order for...
And I see my time has expired.
Okay.
Oh, Representative Woolsey is just giving me... Oh, I'm sorry. I thought... I swear I saw that time sign. Yeah.
I'd like to make one comment.
Well, thank you. Go ahead.
A number of military radar operators and FAA radar operators have called me, and basically what they said was that they were told not to tell the pilots that there was a UFO out there. Always deny the fact the UFO exists and turn the aircraft away so there's no chance of hitting it or whatever. The point is that I don't think there's any radar people here, but that's what I've been told. Also, I understand there's some way that they program the computer so they're less likely to show the UFOs because they're usually moving at very low altitude or very high altitude at very high speeds. And the tendency for the radar not to pick them up. But if you go back to the raw radar data,
I
you
hate
can
to
get
do
it.
this, I really do, because I love what you're to get this information, but my time has expired.
Oh, it's too bad.
I think I'm next.
Yes. Oh, excuse me, Representative Woolsey, go ahead. You have, in fact, 4 minutes.
Okay, Pilot Courant, you mentioned in your testimony that you and a group had met with a group of representatives on the Hill, senators and
Right.
and
This was 20
How?
years ago, but there were private meetings where I'd met these people on flights, and we got talking, and they invited me to meet them on the subject. They were interested. Some of them are still active.
Well, so it was on the airplane. It was not in their office. And
They invited me into their office
okay,
after I
well,
met
if you
them
go
on
in their
flights.
office, guess what?
I know.
It's public. They work for everybody out there. But you don't have to tell who they are. But they would be, if you would if they were as interested as you say, if somebody in the Paradigm Group or the organizers here knew who they were, that might be a first step for us to get this back onto the radar of the Congress to ask for a hearing. That would be you've got to find this. We've got to find the thread. You'd think we'd know, but we don't know the person that's going to be willing to do that. But if somebody has expressed interest to you, or you could call them maybe directly yourself if you would be willing. It would be a start.
I wish it was that easy, but even
Well-
you folks the other day said if you were active in Congress or Senate at this time, you probably wouldn't ask for a hearing on this.
Well, I probably would on the Science Committee because that would be the perfect committee for this because it's not it's not really political and but after this week I would, now that I've got information.
No, on one of my flights I asked, it kind of went the wrong way where I asked the senator, he was friends with some very well-to-do friends of mine and they were main campaign fundraisers. So we got talking, and it was just he and I out in the waiting area before his flight, and I asked him, Senator, do you think there's a chance of ever having another congressional hearing like 1968 with Gerald Ford? And he said, no, never.
Okay.
It's all been explained away.
Well,
There's
okay,
no
that
need
was
for
one
that.
of them, but I just thought maybe you'd found somebody that had some interest.
Well, they're still active.
I
the
would
people
like
that asked me.
Mr. Callahan to be able to complete you had something you wanted to say. and I want to
I
make, I
started,
have a
I came out
minute.
of the military as an air traffic control. I started with the FAA when it was known as the CAA. Before radar, we controlled with strips. When they brought the first radar unit into the facility, it was an old VG scope that the Navy used to use. And the instructions was 26 pages, and nobody knew how to use radar. We started off with what they had was just a broadband radar, raw radar. And eventually they were able to draw airways on this VG scope that we're looking at. And we had to do all kinds of things. When the pilot called on the frequency and he's approaching Harrisonburg, you look down there and there's like 15 people all in that area. So you would tell them to make a right turn 30 degrees for 30 seconds, then resume your navigation, and you would look to see who's turning. Sometimes 2 or 3 people would turn because sometimes the pilots have a real sense of humor. And eventually you give this guy a couple turns and you'd pick him up and say, he's there. That's the primary target. It's only a dash. We had all kinds of trouble keeping them separated from one another because they weren't all flying under the FAA control. They invented the transponder. They made it mandatory that you have to have a transponder to fly above certain altitudes. The transponder now gives a signal so that you'll always see the target. But if there's somebody flying alongside of them that doesn't have a transponder, he shows up as a dot. The dot is always there. If it's a UFO and he's traveling at 3,000 to 4,000 miles an hour, when you look at your scope, you see him here. Okay, and 10 seconds later, he's over here. He's nowhere near your area that you're controlling traffic on. You get 1 hit, maybe 2. He gets 1 hit on his sector and it's gone. He wouldn't know that was a UFO. And as long as I've been in the FAA, and I had worked up to the position where I was the guy in charge of all the air traffic people in the United States, if they screwed up on their phraseology, it was my fault. That was the new thing after the strike. So I knew everything, and we did everything. We never told our controllers not to report a UFO. We did tell them not to solicit a near-miss report, because when you bring 2 airplanes too close together, they would file what we called a near-miss. Well, they were getting too many near-misses, so they said, do not ask the pilot if he wants to file a near-miss. When he gets on the ground, he can do it. But that's the only thing we restricted of filing was a near-miss report, not a UFO.
And I see that our time for this panel has expired. I want to thank the panel. This has been very interesting. Also like to say that if we can keep this hearing to just a 10-minute break right now, and be back by 11:10, if it's 11 o'clock right now, then we can work in a lunch period. Let's not forget we've got 4 more panels today to be heard from. So thank you. This is recessed for 10 minutes.
Now, there's 4 with closing remarks. That's what it shows on here. Steve, everybody's going to want to make a closing remark. Everybody's going to want to make a closing remark. Well, you might want to do it before you and Hellier then. Let the panel talk at 5 and you two be last. 5 to 5:30.
Well, on this, now, this closing, these are just closing remarks, but at this one, it's only 3, yeah, go 23. No problem.
Let me see.
Would you like to keep in with the latest?
I was going to offer you 15. Where we've had 6 panelists, 10 minutes each is an hour. Where we only have 3, you could certainly take 15. If you want 20, that's fine. Okay. I'll make that happen. What you cut into is the Q&A. You're taking 5 minutes.